She found out about the engagement the same way she found out about most things that hurt her. By accident, in a room full of people, with nowhere to go. But that is not where this story begins. It begins 2 years earlier, in a coffee shop that smelled like burned milk and old wood, on a Tuesday afternoon when she had nowhere better to be, and nothing better to do than sit across from a man who would quietly change the entire direction of her life. His name was Oliver, not a dramatic name, not the kind of name that announces itself when it walks into a room, just Oliver. Tall, quiet, the kind of person who watches everything before he says anything. He had dark eyes and a careful way of speaking, like every word had been considered before it was released into the world. She liked that about him. She had always been the kind of person who talked first and thought second, and there was something calming about someone who operated in reverse. They met through Nina, her friend from work. Nina had invited a group of people to a casual birthday gathering at a wine bar, and Oliver had come along with someone else, though that person disappeared early in the evening and Oliver stayed. He stayed long after the cake was cut, long after most of the other guests had drifted out into the night. He and she had ended up at the corner of the bar, talking about nothing in particular. Her job, his interest in architecture, a documentary about deep-sea creatures they had both seen and both found unsettling. It was the kind of conversation that doesn't feel important while it is happening, and then turns out to have been very important indeed. He asked for her number before he left. She gave it to him without hesitating. He was French. She knew this early, but it did not feel like a significant fact at first. Plenty of people were French. He had grown up in Lyon, moved to London for university, and stayed because he found a job he liked and a city that suited him. His English was excellent, fluent, precise, occasionally formal in a way that made ordinary sentences sound considered. He used words like certainly and I wonder in conversation, and she found this endearing rather than stiff. The French part only became significant later, when it became the thing that connected them and, eventually, the thing that divided the world into people who understood what was happening and people who did not. Their first few months together were easy. That is the only word for it. Easy in the way that good things sometimes are at the beginning, before the weight of real life settles in and you discover what something actually costs. They walked a lot. Oliver liked to walk, and she discovered she liked walking too, which surprised her, because before him she had considered it a thing people did only when they had no other option. They cooked together on weekends. They disagreed about films and agreed about food and stayed up too late on nights when neither of them had anywhere to be the next morning. He was not a man who said, "I love you" quickly. She noticed this and did not push. Some people need longer than others to reach that sentence, and she had learned by then that rushing someone toward a feeling they were not ready to name usually just pushed them in the opposite direction. What he did instead was teach her French. Not formally, not with textbooks or structured lessons. It happened in the margins of ordinary life. He would say something in French, a comment about the weather, a reaction to something on television, an observation about a person they passed on the street, and he would not translate it immediately. He would wait. Sometimes she would ask. Sometimes she would guess. Sometimes she would simply accept that she had missed something and feel the small, quiet frustration of being on the outside of a language she did not speak. That frustration turned out to be the best teacher she ever had. She started with an app on her phone, the kind with a little cartoon owl that rewarded her with animations when she completed a lesson. She did it in bed before sleeping, on the train to work. During lunch breaks she spent alone at her desk. She did not tell Oliver at first. She wanted to see how far she could get before he noticed, which was partly about pride and partly about wanting to give him something that surprised him, because she had already understood that Oliver was not easily surprised, and that this was a quality she found both attractive and faintly challenging. He noticed after 6 weeks. They were at a restaurant. French, naturally. The kind of place where the menu was printed in French with English translations in small italics underneath. She ordered in French. Not perfectly, not without an accent that made the waiter smile in a kind rather than mocking way, but she ordered without looking at the English side of the menu, and Oliver looked at her from across the table with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "How long?" he said. 6 weeks, she said. He reached across the table and held her hand, and did not say anything for a moment, and she understood from the quality of his silence that she had done something that mattered to him, even though he would never quite find the words to explain why. After that, the French became part of their relationship, in a way that felt woven in, rather than added on. He spoke to her in French when they were alone, and she answered in French as best she could. He corrected her gently, without making her feel small, which is not as easy as it sounds. He recommended French films, French music, French books she was not ready for but attempted anyway. She listened to French radio while she cleaned her flat. She kept a small notebook where she wrote down words she did not know and looked them up later. She learned the language the way she learned most things she cared about, completely, and with a stubbornness that looked from the outside like patience. By the end of their first year together, she could hold a proper conversation, not about politics or philosophy, not yet, but about real things, about feelings and frustrations and small daily observations. She could argue in French, which felt like a significant milestone, because arguing requires a level of fluency that polite conversation does not demand. Oliver seemed pleased, more than pleased. There was something in the way he spoke to her in French, in the particular ease of it, that felt like intimacy of a different kind, like they had built a small private room inside their relationship that no one else could easily enter. She thought this was a good thing. For a long time, she was certain it was. The second year was different from the first in ways she could feel but could not entirely name. Oliver was still there. He was still attentive, still thoughtful, still the person she had come to rely on in the way you come to rely on something so quietly that you do not notice it is load-bearing until much later. But there were new gaps in him, small ones, the kind that do not announce themselves but accumulate. He traveled more for work. He was harder to reach on evenings when he was away. He was present in the room but occasionally not quite present in the conversation, and she would catch herself watching him across a table and wondering what he was actually thinking, which was strange, because for a long time she had felt certain she knew. She did not want to be the kind of person who read disaster into ordinary distance. People got busy. Relationships shifted through seasons. She told herself these things and mostly believed them. She kept learning French, not because she thought it would fix whatever was quietly shifting, but because by then, the language belonged to her as much as it belonged to anything else in her life. She had earned it. It was not just Oliver's anymore. She passed an intermediate proficiency exam in the spring of that second year. She did not tell Oliver, not because she was hiding it, but because she had stopped performing her accomplishments for him somewhere along the way. She put the certificate in a drawer and went to work the next morning, and felt, for reasons she could not entirely explain, quietly proud of herself, in a way that had nothing to do with him. It was around this time that he began to seem elsewhere, even when he was standing right next to her. Not cold. Oliver was never cold, but there was a quality of removal in him that she had not noticed before, or had noticed, and chosen not to examine. He was kind in the way that people are kind when they are trying to compensate for something. He brought her coffee without being asked. He remembered small things she mentioned in passing. He was, if anything, more considerate than he had been in the first year, and she had read enough about relationships by then to know that heightened consideration sometimes meant the opposite of what it looked like. She did not ask him directly. She was not ready to hear the answer. So she waited. Not because she was weak or foolish or willing to accept anything. She waited because some part of her already knew, and knowing without confirmation still left her a version of her life she was not ready to give up. She waited because she had invested 2 years and a whole language into this person, and she was not prepared to admit that the investment had not produced what she thought it would. She waited until she could not anymore. The end, when it came, did not come in a conversation. It did not come with a clear explanation, or a closed door. It came in the way that certain endings come, gradually, and then completely, and then with a silence that was somehow louder than anything that had been said. Oliver stopped showing up. Not physically. He continued to exist in the same city, continued to answer messages with enough warmth to prevent a real confrontation, continued to be present in the marginal and insufficient way of someone who has already left but has not yet said so out loud. She eventually said it for him. She told him that she knew. She told him that she was not going to spend any more time waiting for something he had already decided. She said this in English, which felt right, because this was her language, and this was her truth, and she was not performing it for anyone. He did not argue. He was not the kind of person who argued. He said he was sorry. He meant it, she thought, in the way that people mean things they cannot change. He said she deserved more than he had managed to give her. She agreed, and she left, and she did not cry until she was home. The language stayed with her. The language had always been going to stay with her. She just did not know yet what it was going to cost her to discover that. She thought, in those first weeks after Oliver, that the hardest part was behind her. People always think that. They find the floor of the thing, they survive landing on it, and they tell themselves that this is the worst of it. The impact, the initial stillness, the first few mornings when the shape of the loss is still unfamiliar and enormous. She did not yet know that the floor is not always the deepest point. Sometimes there is more underneath. Her name was Clara, 29 years old, a project coordinator at a mid-sized events company, a woman who had spent 2 years learning French for a man who had not stayed and had kept learning it anyway, because she had realized, somewhere along the way, that the language was hers now, and no one could revoke it. She lived in a flat in East London with 2 houseplants she was terrible at remembering to water, and a reading chair by the window that had absorbed enough of her evenings to feel like a companion. She was, by most measures, fine. She went to work, she answered emails. She went out with Nina when Nina arranged it, and declined when she did not feel like pretending. She slept reasonably well on most nights. She ate proper meals instead of the random assemblage of whatever required no effort that had characterized her first 2 weeks after the breakup. She was fine. She was simply fine in the careful, deliberate way that is not yet the same as actually being well. The message from Nina arrived on a Thursday evening, while Clara was on the sofa with a cup of tea and a French novel she was 3/4 through and enjoying more than she had expected. Nina wrote casually, the way she always wrote, a stream of thoughts with minimal punctuation and maximum enthusiasm. A dinner, Saturday, at the Italian place on Gordon Street that they all liked. A group of them. Nothing special, just people. It would be good for Clara to get out. Clara said yes without thinking about it too hard. Getting out was something she had decided to do more of, and this fit neatly into that decision. She did not ask who else was coming. This was not unusual. Nina's gatherings were always a loose arrangement of whoever was available, people who were friends of friends, connections from different parts of Nina's large and sociable life. Clara had met interesting people at Nina's dinners before. She had also sat next to perfectly nice strangers with whom she had nothing in common, and spent 2 hours talking about property prices, which was less enjoyable but survivable. She did not ask. It did not occur to her that she needed to. She found out 2 days before, on a Thursday afternoon, when Nina called rather than texted, which was already a signal that something required more than a message. Nina's voice had the particular quality of someone delivering news they feel responsible for, even though they are not. A gentle overpronunciation of ordinary syllables, a slight hesitation before names. Oliver was coming, and he was bringing someone. Nina apologized twice in the first 30 seconds, which was at least twice more than was warranted, given that she could not have known. Clara told her this. She told Nina it was fine, that it had been 9 months, that she was a grown woman, that she had no intention of staying home from a dinner because of a person she used to know. All of this was true. She also immediately went and stood in her kitchen for several minutes doing nothing, which is what the body does when the mind is trying to manage something it has not fully processed. She went anyway. She always went. This was one of the things about Clara that was both a strength and occasionally a source of difficulty. She did not retreat from things just because they were uncomfortable. She had decided, at some early point in her adult life, that avoidance was a form of losing, and she had very little tolerance for losing. She put on a dress she liked and earrings she rarely wore, and left the flat at 7:10. The restaurant was warm and full of the particular noise of an Italian place on a Saturday, cutlery and conversation and the smell of something with garlic and someone's birthday being celebrated at a table near the window. Nina was already there, seated at the long table near the back, and she spotted Clara immediately, and waved with both hands, which was very Nina. There were 8 of them in total. Clara knew 4 of them. She was introduced to the others, a couple named Patrick and Louise, and a quiet man named Gregory, who worked with Oliver in some capacity she did not catch, because Oliver arrived before the introduction was finished, and the arrival of Oliver temporarily consumed her attention in the way of something you have been bracing for, and still find yourself unprepared for when it actually happens. He looked well. This was the first, honest, involuntary thought. He looked rested and well-dressed, and he walked into the room with the same quiet confidence she had always found difficult to ignore. He was talking to the woman beside him, already mid-sentence, and the woman was laughing at whatever he was saying, and Clara looked at this for exactly as long as it took her to decide she was not going to spend the evening looking at it. And then she turned back to Nina and asked about Nina's week, with the specific focused energy of someone who has chosen a direction and intends to stay in it. The woman's name was Amélie. Clara learned this when the introductions circled around the table. Amélie was French. Of course she was. She was perhaps 30, or 32, with the easy elegance of someone who had never had to decide whether she looked comfortable in a room. She simply did. She was warm when she shook Clara's hand, and her English was good, lightly accented, and she smiled in a way that was genuine rather than performed. Clara liked her immediately, and felt no guilt whatsoever about how inconvenient this was. Oliver introduced her. "This is Amélie," he said, simply, and did not add anything to this, which told Clara everything she needed to know about where things stood between them. You do not just say a name like that, unless the name has already explained itself to everyone who needs to know. "Nice to meet you," Clara said, and meant it, because Clara was the kind of person who meant things even when she would have preferred not to. She sat 3 seats down from Oliver on the opposite side of the table. This felt like the right distance, close enough not to seem deliberate, far enough to breathe. Patrick was on her left, Gregory on her right, and she turned her attention to them with the gratitude of someone who has just been handed an obvious place to look. The dinner moved through its usual rhythms. Menus, orders, the small negotiations of a large table deciding on shared starters. Wine was poured. Conversations overlapped and separated and overlapped again. Patrick, it turned out, had strong opinions about train systems, which was not a subject Clara had ever felt strongly about, but which she found she could discuss with some engagement after Patrick made her realize how interesting the engineering involved actually was. Gregory was quiet but thoughtful, and said several things she wanted to remember later. She was doing well. She was eating her food and participating in the conversation, and not staring at the wrong end of the table, and she was aware of doing these things, but doing them anyway, which counts as doing them. The pasta was excellent. She ordered the cacio e pepe because she always ordered the cacio e pepe when it was on the menu, and this one was properly made, with a generous amount of black pepper and the kind of consistency that required actual skill. She told this to Patrick, who agreed, and they spent a comfortable few minutes discussing pasta, which was the sort of pleasant and meaningless conversation that is underrated as a social tool. Nina caught her eye once across the table and gave her a look that was both apologetic and encouraging, and Clara returned it with a look that she hoped communicated, "I am genuinely fine, please stop checking on me," which she was not entirely certain translated. Dessert menus arrived. The table shifted into the slightly looser, warmer mode of a dinner that has passed successfully through its main event. Someone ordered tiramisu. Someone else debated aloud between 2 options and asked for opinions. The candles on the table had burned lower. The noise of the restaurant had become comfortable rather than intrusive. Clara ordered the panna cotta. She had just decided this, had just told the waiter, had just handed back the menu, when the quality of the air at the table changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was the particular stillness that settles over a group of people when one person has decided to say something, and the group senses it before the words arrive. Clara felt it before she identified it. She looked up. Oliver was standing. He stood the way he always did everything, without flourish, without announcement, simply deciding to do a thing, and doing it. He was not a dramatic man. He did not tap a glass or clear his throat. He simply rose from his seat. And because Oliver was the sort of person whose presence registered even in rooms full of other people, the conversation quieted around him like water settling. Clara felt the stillness reach her before she fully understood it. Something moved through her chest. Not quite a feeling, more like the precursor to one, the body's way of registering that something significant is approaching before the mind catches up. She held her fork lightly against the edge of her dessert plate and did not move. Oliver looked at Amélie, only at Amélie, and he began to speak. He spoke in French. Clara understood this choice in the first 3 words. She understood it the way she understood most things Oliver did. Not from what was obvious, but from what was underneath. He had chosen French because most people at this table did not speak it. Patrick did not. Louise did not. Nina certainly did not. Gregory, from what Clara could tell, spoke only English and possibly some German. Oliver knew who in this room understood French and who did not. He had made a calculation. A quiet, deliberate calculation. And she was part of it. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She sat very still and she listened. And she understood every word. He said that Amélie had come into his life at a moment when he had not been expecting anything good, and had not felt he deserved it. He said this with the kind of honesty that lands softly rather than dramatically. And even Clara, sitting 3 seats away and being the specific person this sentence was not intended for, recognized that it was a real thing to say. He said that Amélie was the kind of person who made him want to show up as something better than he had managed to be. He said that he did not want to spend any more of his life wondering what it would feel like to have someone like her permanently beside him. Then he said her name, quietly, like it was something he was taking care of. He said, "Voudrais-tu m'épouser? Would you marry me?" Amélie made a sound, not words, just a sound, the kind that belongs to a moment before language catches up with feeling. And then she said yes, and the table erupted, and someone who was not Clara made a noise that was very close to a sob, and Patrick clapped, and Nina reached for her wine glass, and the whole room tilted briefly on its axis, and righted itself with a couple now formally promised to each other at one end of it. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and breathed. She had understood everything, every sentence, every word, every small and considered phrase. 2 years of French, learned in margins and mornings and late nights and quiet stubbornness, and she had not missed a single piece of it. He had not expected that. He had arranged for it to arrive as music to everyone else, beautiful and emotional and slightly mysterious, a romantic gesture sealed in another language. He had done it this way so that the room could celebrate without any complicated awareness of who else was sitting in it. He had thought he was being elegant. He had not known that she was going to hear him. She looked at Oliver once, just once, and he was already looking at her. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, but the closest thing to it that Oliver's careful features were capable of producing. A recognition. She had understood. He knew she had understood. She looked at him for exactly as long as it took to confirm this between them. And then she looked at her panna cotta, and she picked up her spoon, and she took a bite, because the panna cotta was very good, and she had ordered it, and she intended to eat it. The table had not quite settled. People were still congratulating, still passing warmth down the long stretch of the dinner, and nobody was watching Clara particularly, because nobody knew there was anything to watch. And this was exactly the kind of invisibility that she had always found both a comfort and an occasional indignity. Nina glanced at her once, and Clara gave her a look that said nothing and everything, and Nina picked up her wine and drank deeply, and wisely said nothing at all. Clara finished her dessert. She listened to the conversation reconstruct itself around the new shape of the evening. She asked Louise a question about something Louise had mentioned earlier in the dinner, a trip she was planning, and Louise answered warmly and at length, and Clara listened with genuine attention, because she was the kind of person who, once she had decided to be present somewhere, actually was. She was present. She was entirely present. She was also sitting with something in her chest that she had not yet named, and was not going to name here, not in this room, not at this table, not in front of all these people who did not know they were watching something she had not asked to be part of. She was going to name it later, in private, where it belonged. For now she was here, and she was fine, and the candles were burning lower, and the evening was going to end the way evenings ended, with coats and cold air and the business of getting home, and she was going to let it. She had understood everything he said. He had not expected that, and the knowledge of it sat inside her like a stone that had not yet decided whether it was heavy or useful. She suspected, by the time the bill arrived, that it was going to be both. She raised her glass before she had fully decided to. That was how she would remember it afterward, not as a calculated move, not as something she had planned in the 30 seconds between deciding and doing it, but as the kind of action that belongs to the part of a person that moves before the cautious mind can arrange an objection. The table was still warm with noise. Amelie was crying lightly. The good kind of crying. The kind that comes with a smile already underneath it. Oliver was seated again, and he had his arm around her, and the people who had been clapping were settling back into their chairs with the particular softness of a group that has just shared something and not yet returned to ordinary conversation. Clara stood. It was not a dramatic gesture. She simply stood, the way people stand when they intend to speak, and the table registered it in the way that tables register these things, gradually, then completely, until the conversation quieted and 7 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Oliver's eyes were among them. She felt them land before she looked at him directly. She looked at him directly, and she spoke in French. Not the French of someone performing, not the careful, qualified French of a person who wants credit for trying. She spoke the French she had built inside herself over 2 years of early mornings and late nights and a little notebook full of words she had looked up because she refused to not know them. The French she had built out of stubbornness and curiosity and, if she was being completely honest, love. The kind of love that turns itself into action even when the person it is directed at does not fully deserve the effort. She said that she wanted to raise a glass to 2 people who had clearly found something worth finding. She said this with a clean, formal construction that made Gregory look up from his wineglass with mild surprise, because Gregory, it turned out, spoke enough French to recognize that what he was hearing was not basic. She said that there was nothing more worth having in a life than the person who chose to stay in it, not because they had to, not because leaving was too complicated, but because they genuinely wanted to be there. Every ordinary day, in the rooms and the silences and the seasons of a shared life. She paused here, not for effect, because she meant it, and meaning it required a breath. She said that she wished them exactly that, a life of choosing each other, not just once at a table with candles and good pasta, but again and again in the smaller and less romantic moments that are the actual substance of 2 people building something together. She said, and this was the part she had not planned, the part that arrived from somewhere beneath the carefully managed surface of the evening, that love deserved a person who showed up completely, without reservation, without the part of themselves held back in a separate room that the other person was never quite invited into. She said she believed they had found that in each other. She said she hoped they knew how rare it was. She raised her glass. "Felicitation," she said. "Congratulations." And then she said their names, both names, Amelie first, and she drank. The table followed. There was warmth in it, genuine warmth, and someone said, "Here, here," which was Patrick, and Nina made a sound that was mostly composed of emotion she was trying not to show, and Louise touched Clara's arm briefly as she sat back down in a way that communicated solidarity without requiring words. Amelie looked at her across the table with an expression that was open and unguarded and said, in French, "That was beautiful. Thank you." "You are welcome," Clara said, in French, simply. And then she picked up her spoon and ate the last 2 bites of her panna cotta, because they were there, and because they were good, and because she had decided at some point in the last several minutes that she was going to finish what she had started this evening, including the dessert. Oliver had not spoken. He had not said anything since she stood, and he had not said anything since she sat back down. She was aware of this the way you are aware of a specific absence in a room, not loudly, but with certainty. She did not look at him again immediately. She gave him the courtesy of not watching whatever was happening on his face, which was something she would not have done a year ago, and which felt, in this moment, like a measure of how far she had actually come. When she did glance at him, finally, his expression was something she could not easily name. Not guilt, though it was in that family. Not admiration exactly, though there was an element of that too. It was the expression of a person who has just seen something they did not anticipate, something that has required them to revise a picture they were carrying, and who does not yet know what to do with the revision. She held his gaze for 1 second, and then looked away. Not dramatically, just done. The evening continued the way evenings continue after their largest moments have passed, gently, with the relieved warmth of a group that has come through something significant together, and can now return to the ordinary business of being people. The bill was discussed. Someone had a coat mix-up. Patrick told a story about a dinner he had once attended, where someone's speech had gone very differently, and it made the table laugh. And Clara laughed with them because it was genuinely funny. She stayed until the natural end. She did not leave early. She was not going to be the person who left early, not tonight. Because leaving early would mean that the evening had been too much for her. And it had not been too much for her. It had been exactly the right amount of too much, which is to say it had been manageable, and she had managed it, and she was going to finish managing it, with her coat on, and her bag over her shoulder, and a proper goodbye to everyone at the table. She hugged Nina last, near the door, and Nina held on a moment longer than a regular hug, which was Nina's way of saying everything she could not say, with Oliver standing 10 feet away. Clara pressed her back and then pulled away, and said she would call her tomorrow, and she meant it. She shook Patrick's hand. She hugged Louise, who turned out to be a warmer hugger than expected. She said goodbye to Gregory, who nodded with the brevity of someone who communicates most effectively in nods. She said goodbye to Amélie, who reached for her hands and held them briefly and said, again in French, "You speak beautifully. How long have you been learning?" "About 2 years," Clara said. Amélie smiled and said that it showed, and that she hoped Clara continued, because it was a wonderful thing to carry with you through life. A language. Clara said she intended to. Oliver was standing slightly behind Amélie. Clara looked at him. He looked at her. There was a great deal happening in the space between them, and neither of them said any of it, which was probably correct. "Take care of yourself," she said to him, in English. He said, "You too." She turned and walked out into the cold and did not look back, because she was 30 years old, and she had been through harder things than this, and she was going to go home now and feel whatever she needed to feel without an audience. The night air hit her like a decision, cold and certain and entirely her own. She had spoken French in front of him, and in front of all of them, properly and without apology, and she had meant every word she said, not as a performance, not as a point to prove. She had meant it the way you mean things that have been true inside you for a long time, and have simply been waiting for the right moment to find the air. She had raised a glass to 2 people who were genuinely going to build a life together, and she had done it in the language she had learned for a different reason, and the language had turned out to be bigger than the reason. That was the thing she had not expected. That was what was sitting in her chest as she walked toward the main road to find a car home, not the loss, not the particular sting of that evening, but the quiet, steady recognition that she had done something genuinely well. She had kept going when the obvious reason to stop was right in front of her, and she was still going, and the French was still hers, and she was going to cry in about 15 minutes, and that was fine. It was fine. Everything, in its own complicated and uncomfortable way, was fine. She cried in the car home. She had known she would. She had been holding it with both hands since somewhere around the main course, and the weight of it had been reasonable but not light. And the moment the door closed and the driver said "long night," in the mild and disinterested way of someone who has driven many people home from many difficult evenings, she said, "A bit, yes," and turned toward the window and let it go. Not loudly, not in the gasping, uncontrolled way of something catastrophic. She cried in the quiet way of someone releasing pressure that has been building for a controlled and reasonable amount of time. The kind of crying that is almost productive, that has a beginning and a middle and an end, and that leaves you feeling lighter rather than hollowed. She cried for about 6 minutes. She knew this because she watched the streetlights pass and counted intersections in a half-conscious way, and by the time they had gone through 4 of them she was mostly done, which felt about right. The driver, to his considerable credit, did not comment. She arrived home, paid, thanked him, and stood outside her building for a moment in the cold, just standing, not thinking about anything in particular, but also not quite ready to go up yet. The street was quiet. It was late enough that the last of the evening foot traffic had thinned. A cat was sitting on the low wall of the building next door, watching her with the supreme indifference of a creature that has never had to manage other people's feelings. She looked at the cat looked at her. "Okay," she said quietly, to no one in particular. She went upstairs. The flat felt familiar in the particular way it does when you have been away from it for an evening, and return with something different in you than what you left with. She dropped her bag on the chair by the door. She took off her earrings, the ones she rarely wore, and set them on the little dish on the hall table, the one she had bought at a market 18 months ago, when she and Oliver had gone together to Portobello Road, and she had not been able to resist it even though she had not needed it. She did not think about that now. She was very carefully not thinking about a number of things, which is different from not feeling them. She made tea because it was what she always did, and because sometimes the most useful thing a body can do is something small and ordinary. She stood in the kitchen while the kettle heated, and looked at her houseplants on the windowsill, a succulent that had somehow survived 2 years of neglect, and a small lemon tree that Nina had given her as a birthday gift, and that she had managed, surprisingly, to keep alive. She thought about what Amélie had said at the door. It is a wonderful thing to carry with you through life. A language. She had meant it kindly. Clara was sure she had meant it kindly, without any awareness of the particular weight the words carried in this specific context, for this specific woman, in relation to this specific language. Amélie had simply been expressing something true. And it was true. Clara turned the thought over in her mind, and found that it remained true no matter how she angled it. A language was a thing to carry, a useful, portable, permanent thing that did not diminish from being used and could not be taken from you simply because the circumstances that produced it had changed. She had learned French because she loved Oliver, or because she had been trying to love him, to reach something in him that might let her love land properly, and it had not worked, not because she had failed. She understood now with a clarity that felt new, but because there are some people who are not available to be reached, not through any fault of theirs or yours, but simply because the door they have opened does not face the direction you are approaching from. She had learned French for the wrong reasons, in the way that you sometimes put enormous effort into something, for a reason that later turns out to be incomplete or mistaken. And then the reason had gone, and the French had remained, and she had kept learning it because she had already fallen in love with it independently, because the language had turned out to be more interesting than the reason she had started it. This was one of the stranger gifts that life occasionally produced, something that arrived for one reason and stayed for another. She took her tea to the reading chair. The French novel was where she had left it, splayed face down on the side table, 3/4 through, and with 100 pages still to go. She picked it up and looked at the cover, and then set it down again, not because she did not want to read it, but because she was not yet quite ready to. She sat with the tea and the quiet of the flat, and let the evening settle around her properly. The thing that she kept coming back to, the thing that would not sit still, was not Oliver. It was not the engagement, not the French speech at the table, not even the particular sting of having to raise a glass and smile while holding all of it inside. It was the moment when she had actually spoken, when she had stood up and found the words in a language she had built herself, word by word, and put them into the room, and meant every one of them. She had not expected to mean them. She had expected to say something polished and managed, something that served its social function without costing her too much. And then the words had come out with a truth in them that she had not entirely planned, about love and showing up and the people who choose to stay, and she had meant it. She had been speaking to the room, and she had also been, without intending to, speaking to herself. Love deserved a person who showed up completely. She had said this to bless a couple she barely knew, and she had also been saying it to the part of herself that had spent 2 years trying to reach someone who kept one room locked, who was attentive and warm and present in almost every way, and still somehow not quite there. She had not been wrong to try. She understood that now, sitting in her reading chair with her tea cooling in her hands. She had not been foolish or desperate or undiscriminating. She had recognized something real in Oliver, and she had invested in it, and the investment had not produced what she hoped. But the investment itself had not been a mistake. Some things are worth trying even when they do not work. Some effort produces value that is not the value you were aiming for. She had aimed for Oliver. She had ended up with French. She had ended up, along the way, with a version of herself she actually liked quite a bit. She sat in the chair for a long time. At some point she picked up the novel and read the last 100 pages, and they were good, and the ending surprised her, and she sat with it in the quiet of the early morning and felt the particular satisfaction of a story that resolved in a way she had not anticipated but that felt, in retrospect, like the only way it could have gone. She closed the book. She thought about what came next. Not the large version, not the question of who she would meet, or what her life would look like, or whether she would ever stand in a restaurant speaking French to someone for a reason that had nothing to do with managing a difficult evening. She was not there yet, and she did not need to be. She thought about the smaller version. The week ahead, the class she had been meaning to sign up for, an advanced French conversation group, held twice a week at a community center not far from where she lived, a thing she had seen advertised months ago, and noted, and not yet done anything about. She had not done anything about it because something in her had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for a reason to stop treating French as the thing she had done for Oliver, and start treating it as the thing she was doing for herself. She had that now. She had it clearly and without ambiguity. She got up, went to her desk, opened her laptop, and found the page for the class. It was still running. There was still space. Registration took 4 minutes. She did it. She made a second cup of tea, and went back to the chair, and sat in the early morning quiet of her flat, and did not feel fixed, because things do not fix that quickly, and she was not naive about what the next few months might feel like. Grief had its own pace, and she had learned, through several previous encounters with it, that the most useful thing you could do was let it move at the pace it was going to move at, and stop trying to hurry it toward its conclusion. But she felt clear, cleaner than she had at the beginning of the evening, which was unexpected, and which she was going to accept without over-examining. She had sat in a room where the person she had loved announced his engagement in a language he had not expected her to understand. She had understood everything. She had stood up and spoken in that same language, and meant what she said. She had gone home and cried in a car for 6 minutes, and then sat with a cat, and made tea, and finished a novel, and registered for a class. This was not a triumphant ending. She was not writing her own triumphant ending tonight, sitting in a flat in East London, with a houseplant that needed water, and earrings in a dish by the door. She was writing the part that comes between the difficult thing and the better thing, the part that requires you to simply continue and water the plants, and go to the class, and use the language, and trust that you are building something even when you cannot yet see what it is. She had learned French for a man who had not stayed. She had kept French because it was hers. And she was, it turned out, just getting started with it. The lemon tree on the windowsill caught the first pale light of the early morning, and she looked at it and thought it could use some water, and got up to take care of it, and felt, in the most ordinary and unheroic way, like herself, like entirely herself, like someone who still had a great deal of living ahead of her, in whatever language she chose.